Hello, everyone. Hello, book lovers. Welcome to our session number 6 of the guided reading of Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility. How are you today? Are you ready for our Jane Austen session? Do you have your tea or your coffee? I have to say that it's snowing outside. So that's perfect weather to just be inside with curled up with a book, Jane Austen's book, even better, and a warm drink. Very cozy, right? So I don't know where you are watching or listening from right now. I would love to know. Um, and we have a very nice session today. We are getting close to the end of volume the first of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Um, Before we start, I would like to remind you that if you've missed the previous sessions, you can watch the recordings of sessions 1 to 5. They are available on YouTube. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so then you help Books and Culture to grow, and you also get a notification whenever there is a new video available for you. I would also like to remind you of the upcoming theme course, the Jane Austen Club. I'm very excited about this course. Um, Hi, Megan. Nice to see you here. She says, coffee ready, my puppy Enola on my lap, and so jealous of the snow. Oh, what a nice name, Enola, for your puppy. That's also super cozy, right? To curl up with your pet. And says, hi, Fernanda, looking forward to today. Great to have you. Megan and Miche are both students at the Creative Reader Academy, so very nice to see you here. And as part of the Creative Reader Academy, both Megan and Miche will get access to the course, the Jane Austen Club, that's launching on the 27th of March. So if you're interested in joining this course, you should take a look at the website, booksandculture.club, for you to have an idea what we're going to talk about in this course. We're going to talk about Jane Austen's life, her relationship with her family, her early fiction, the Regency era, so the context in which she published all her novels. The 19th century professional woman writer, what was it like for women to write and, more importantly, to get their works published in this early 19th century context? Her published works, her letters, the posthumous works as well, the critical reception of her work, etc. There is a lot of nice stuff. So if you enjoy Jane Austen and you would like to dig deeper into her work, you do not want to miss this course. And if you go to the website right now, you can sign up for the wait list. In this case, you will be notified when the course is open for registration. Excellent. So last time we talked about chapters 14 to 17. And some of the things we talked about includes Mrs. Jennings, the character of Mrs. Jennings. I wrote down a curious and inconvenient character who wants to know all about everyone. She's such a nosy character, right? And the more personal other people's business, the better. So remember when Colonel Brandon had to leave very suddenly? She needs to know why. And she pushes him. She keeps asking questions. And we know, we've talked about this here, that the social conventions of the time demanded that private business remain private, especially if you're not very close, if you do not have a very close relationship, such as Colonel Brandon and Mrs. Jennings. So she was being very impolite to keep asking Colonel Brandon about his private business. And she even throws to the table, so she says it openly that it might have had something to do with Miss Williams, who was apparently um, Colonel Brandon's illegitimate daughter. So that's a very private business, as she just says it publicly. Um, so you can see the kind of character that she is. Jane Austen uses the character of Mrs. Jennings really to criticize in a very sarcastic way, right? She exaggerates her. Um, and that's a narrative device that Austen uses a lot, the exaggeration for comic purposes. So she becomes a funny character because she's so over the top. But Austen is criticizing the social um, relations at the time, and especially criticizing gossip. So gossip hurts. It causes misunderstandings, causes a lot of um, problems for other people. Um, and the embodiment of gossip in Sense and Sensibility is Mrs. Jennings, right? So Marianne and Willoughby continue to demonstrate affection to one another. Um, last time we read. But Eleanor wonders about the delay of the announcement of their engagement. They were showing affection publicly, which meant that they were probably engaged. Otherwise, it would be inappropriate to be so open with, in her case, in Marianne's case, with a man, right? So it was socially accepted as long as they were engaged, but they had not said it out loud yet. So, especially Eleanor, the sensible one, uh, wanted to have proof of their engagement so that she could relax. And we read a very interesting chapter in which Willoughby says he doesn't want anything to change. He wants, it's as if he wanted to freeze time just as it was there with the Dashwoods, with Marianne. If he could make that moment last forever. So, a romantic wish to freeze his happiness. And then it makes me, a reader, perhaps you as well, makes me wonder. So, at that time, was that just a coincidence that he said that right before he had to leave very abruptly? Or did he already knew? No, did he already know that this what had to be temporary? That's why he did not wish to make any commitments. He was very happy, but it could not last. So he already knew that. And he had that moment of intense sensibility, sharing his feelings. We don't know. Could be either way. And then Willoughby leaves to London very suddenly. Very similar manner to Colin O'Brien, has to leave very suddenly, and he does not seem at liberty to come back soon or to give any more information. And Marianne is devastated. And then we read about how Marianne gives way to all her feelings and how she enjoys to feel feelings, even though they are sad feelings, they're bad feelings. She wants to feel them. She does not want to just forget everything or try to occupy her mind with something else. No, she makes herself remember Willoughby every day. So she plays the same songs they used to play together. She sings those songs. She goes to the same places they went together because she wants to maximize this feeling. Self-destructive, right? She wants to feel terrible. She wants to feel melancholy, which is a very romantic desire, a very romantic characteristic. And Marianne is indeed the personification of romanticism, at least in the beginning. And Eleanor is the personification of realism, if we were to compare literary periods. Um, so Marianne's violent affliction, suffering for Willoughby's absence, a romantic search to enhance feeling until it subsumes into a calmer melancholy. And she would go out on her own. So she sought solitude until, she passed through this period of mourning, let's say, and um, the powerful feelings subdued into a calmer melancholy. Well, Willoughby leaves, but someone else arrives. Edward Ferrars is back. And Edward Ferrars, if you remember from the beginning of the novel, he is Eleanor's love interest. But they have a very different relationship than Willoughby and Marianne. Um, so the only thing that makes Marianne happy right now is that Edward is back because of her sister. So she feels happy because her sister is probably happy, which is very sweet. They have a very nice sister relationship. But when Edward returns, he's very cold and reserved, and he doesn't seem to distinguish Eleanor from the rest. He doesn't give her more attention than he gives herself. And Marianne finds it really, really odd. But Marianne, the practical one, the objective one, the rational one, she restrains and regulates her feelings. So she's not like Marianne who wishes to feel. Marianne closes herself and she does not let it show. Megan says, as a Taylor Swift fan, I can truly say that in modern day, Marianne is pulling a Swiftie, and I know the feeling all too well. Yes. Well, I'm not very familiar with the songs. Some, yes. It would be a very interesting study to compare Marianne's feelings with the feelings described by Taylor Swift um, in her songs. I've seen stuff on the internet, so I know that Taylor Swift is a reader, a book lover like us. So there are literary references in her songs. There are people who study that. So this is the great thing about literary studies or cultural studies more broadly. You can do pretty much whatever you want with what people produce. Culturally, artistically, and I love comparing. So comparative studies. So perhaps what we feel nowadays, the way we demonstrate feelings, is very different from how Marianne did in the early 19th century. But perhaps the essence of feelings is still the same, right? We share that connection as human beings. And then Eleanor's love journey continues while Marianne's is in pause. Misha says, what a coincidence. I'm an ancient Swiftie. That's so cool. So maybe that's something that you would both be interested in um, to look for associations that you can draw between Austen, specifically Marianne or Sensibility, and Swift's lyrics. That's quite interesting. All right. So today we're going to talk about chapters 18 to 21. So we left the story when Edward arrived. So let's see what happens in chapter 18. Eleanor saw with great uneasiness the low spirits of her friend. Her friend here, she means Edward, right? So she called. We start chapter 18 through Eleanor's perspective, and she refers to Edward as her friend. His visit afforded her but a very partial satisfaction, while his own enjoyment in it appeared so imperfect. It was evident that he was unhappy. She wished it were equally evident that he still distinguished her by the same affection which once she had felt no doubt of inspiring. But hitherto the continuance of his preference seemed very uncertain, and the reservedness of his manner towards her contradicted one moment what a more animated look had intimated the preceding one. He joined her and Marianne. So see how Austen here changes perspective. So in the first paragraph, we start chapter 18 through Eleanor's perspective. And Eleanor's perspective is usually a very objective, matter-of-fact language. Edward's, now in the second paragraph, we read it through Edward's, and then it changes to Marianne. And also the way language is used by the narrator is different depending on what character filters the narrator's voice, right? So he, Edward joined her and Marianne in the breakfast room the next morning before the others were down. And Marianne, who was always eager to promote their happiness as far as she could, soon left them to themselves. But before she was halfway upstairs, she heard the parlor door open, and turning round, was astonished to see Edward himself come out. I'm going into the village to see my horses, said he. If you're not yet ready for breakfast, I shall be back again presently. As you are not yet ready for breakfast. So Marian leaves to leave Eleanor and Edward alone, but the moment she goes upstairs, she hears Edward also leaving. So, what is that? Is that some social awkwardness? He's too shy, he doesn't know, he doesn't understand the sign? Or is it that he really does not want to be alone with Eleanor? Um, and why would that be? Why has he changed towards her? Edward returned to them with fresh admiration of the surrounding country. In his walk to the village, he had seen many parts of the valley to advantage, and the village itself, in a much higher situation than the cottage, afforded a general view of the whole, which had exceedingly pleased him. This was a subject which ensured Marianne's attention. Nature, right? And she was beginning to describe her own admiration of these scenes and to question him more minutely on the objects that had particularly struck him when Edward interrupted her by saying, "You must not inquire too far, Marianne. Remember, I have no knowledge in the picturesque, and I shall offend you by my ignorance and want of taste if we come to particulars. I shall call hills steep, which ought to be bold, surfaces strange and uncouth, which ought to be irregular and rugged, and distant objects out of sight, which ought only to be indistinct through the soft medium of a hazy atmosphere. You must be satisfied with such admiration as I can honestly give. I call it a very fine country. The hills are steep, the woods seem full of fine timber, and the valley looks comfortable and snug, with rich meadows and several neat farmhouses scattered here and there. It exactly answers my idea of a fine country because it unites beauty with utility. And I dare say it is a picturesque one too because you admire it. I can easily believe it to be full of rocks and promontories, grey moss and brushwood, but these are all lost on me. I know nothing of the picturesque. This is very interesting. You know, the picturesque, we talked about it, is an aesthetic movement from the late 18th century and consisted in admiring landscapes, nature, as if they were a painting or a picture, an illustration. So you pay attention to details, and there is a focus on decay and ruin, and the contrast between the grandiosity of nature, the long lasting nature, right? For example, mountains. How long do mountains live? Forever, right? In comparison to a human being life, humans' lives are so short and ephemeral in comparison to trees, mountains, the ocean. Um, but he says he does not care for it and that he does not understand it. But the vocabulary that he uses um, indicates that he knows quite something about the um, the movement, because he says, you know, I would say that the hills are steep, but I should use the word bold because that's the picturesque way of describing it. So I should call the surfaces irregular and rugged. I should say that the distant objects are not out of sight, but they're indistinct because of the hazy atmosphere. You see this poetical lens through which you look at nature that he does not care about, but he understands it. So it's not like he's ignorant of it as he claims himself to be. It's just that he does not concur. For him, he says, a fine country unites beauty with utility. So he appreciates nature as through an agricultural point of view, as something useful. So very practical, and similar to Eleanor, right? While Marianne appreciates nature as picturesquely. So, as something to be admired, something that rouses emotion, that rouses certain reflections. So, you see the difference between the two. I am afraid it is but too true, said Marianne. But why should you boast of it? I suspect, said Eleanor, that to avoid one kind of affectation, Edward here falls into another. Because he believes many people pretend to more admiration of the beauties of nature than they really feel, and is disgusted with such pretensions, he affects greater indifference and less discrimination in viewing them himself than he possesses. He is fastidious and will have an affectation of his own. So you see how perceptive Eleanor is. She knows that he knows more than he's saying, but he pretends to know less. He pretends to be ignorant of all because he does not like affectations. So she gets him. But look what Marianne says. It is very true, said Marianne, that admiration of landscape scenery is become a mere jargon. Everybody pretends to feel and tries to describe with the taste and elegance of him who first defined what picturesque beauty was. I detest jargon of every kind, and sometimes I have kept my feelings to myself because I could find no language to describe them in but what was worn and hackneyed out of all sense and meaning. Um, so she is right, Marianne. Now, Marianne speaking the early 19th century, the admiration of landscape scenery has become a mere jargon. The picturesque has become old fashioned. Romanticism has become old fashioned. Um, so these words that were very meaningful before when they were first used by the first poets or people, travelers who used those words, like bold, rugged, irregular, hazy. Now they lost all meaning because they are too commonplace. Everyone uses it. So it's not as powerful anymore. Let's take a look at the footnote on page 416. So when Edward says, I know nothing of the picturesque, a thoroughly disingenuous claim, says the editor, since Edward has just demonstrated an excellent knowledge of the movement in his parodies of its characteristic vocabulary, bold, irregular, rugged, and indistinct through the soft medium of a hazy atmosphere. A concept which, for example, William Gilpin employs in his observations relative chiefly to picturesque beauty, particularly the mountains and lakes of Cumberland and Westmoreland. So, this book by William Gilpin, published in 1786, is one of the founding texts of the picturesque. And in this book, the author writes about nature where a haziness softens the harshness of lines, and above all, it throws over the face of landscape that harmonizing tint which blends the whole into unity and repose. So that's very beautifully described. And by 1786, there was quite new way of looking at nature and of experiencing nature. Before that, I always tell my students, think about the gardens at the Chateau de Versailles in France. You know, that kind of very organized and designed garden landscape. Think about those French gardens, French late 17th, early 18th century gardens. So nature was tamed, was cut, molded to fit the designs of the human beings. But with romanticism, with the picturesque, no. Nature should be wild, uncivilized. It should grow on its own, and we humans should appreciate that. So that was a new way of experiencing nature. But by the early 19th century, that was already kind of a cliche, you know. Um, So, Edward's attack is in part political. Gilpin's picturesque aesthetic looks backwards to a nostalgically conceived landscape in which the realities of modern capitalist agriculture, its enclosures, its profitable timber, its improvements, and its work relations are concealed. In contrast, Edward cites the beauty and utility of the contemporary system that he sees represented in the landscape before his eyes. Um, so this is very interesting. With Romanticism and the picturesque, there was a desire to go back in time and to have a more primitive relationship with nature. One before modernity came, before industrialism, before technology. But Edward is not about looking back in the past and pining over what is lost, but he looks forward. He likes to see all the progress done in the country, um, to see how nature can be used for profit and to help the lives of people. So, beauty in nature for him is united with utility. And that's different from Marianne. That's also different from Willoughby. Remember, Willoughby liked to hunt. So um, his experience with the nature, perception of nature, had to do with male dominance, right? But also very sensitive, also very romantically connected with nature, but still a male superiority. So you see how Edward, Willoughby, and Marianne have different appreciations of nature. And Austen is very smart here in how she combines them all and contrasts them all. So let's continue. I am convinced, said Edward, that you really feel all the delight in a fine prospect which you profess to feel. But in return, your sister must allow me to feel no more than I profess. I like a fine prospect, but not on picturesque principles. I do not like crooked, twisted, blasted trees. I admire them much more if they are tall, straight, and flourishing. I do not like ruined, tattered cottages. I'm not fond of nettles or thistles or heath blossoms. I have more pleasure in a snug farmhouse than a watchtower, and a troop of tidy, happy villagers may please me better than the finest banditti in the world. Again, he's continuing to mock the vocabulary used in picturesque, even Gothic. Gothic and the picturesque were very much associated um, texts. So the finest banditti in the world. So referring to the stories of Anne Radcliffe, he's not that type of reader. And it's also interesting to note how Edward here is talking to Marianne, but he's indirectly talking to Eleanor. They never talk directly, the two of them. He says, but in return, your sister must allow me. So instead of talking directly to Eleanor, he talks to Marianne. Your sister must allow me to feel no more than I profess. Marianne looked with amazement at Edward, with compassion at her sister. Eleanor only laughed. The subject was continued no farther, and Marianne remained thoughtfully silent, till a new object suddenly engaged her attention. She was sitting by Edward, and in taking his tea from Mrs. Dashwood, his hand passed so directly before her as to make a ring with a plait of hair in the centre very conspicuous on one of his fingers. I never saw you wear a ring before, Edward, she cried. Is that Fanny's hair? I remember her promising to give you some, but I should have thought her hair had been darker. So here, Marianne a bit crosses the lines of social etiquette and she comments on a personal item on Edward. He's wearing a ring in which you can see a plait of hair, lock of hair inside. And this was very common, this type of jewelry with parts of the body of the person you loved between 1780 and 1820. So a combination of a sentimental object with a genteel commodity. So it also shows status, right? It was probably a golden ring or something very expensive, but it also had a sentimental meaning. But that's quite a personal question, right? She asks, is that Fanny's hair? Is that your sister's hair? I thought your sister's hair was darker. Marianne spoke inconsiderately what she really felt. But when she saw how much she had pained Edward, her own vexation at her want of thought could not be surpassed by his. He colored very deeply, and giving a momentary glance at Eleanor, replied, yes, it is my sister's hair. The setting always casts a different shade on it, you know. Eleanor had met his eye and looked conscious likewise. That the hair was her own, she instantaneously felt as well satisfied as Marianne. The only difference in their conclusions was that what Marianne considered as a free gift from her sister, Eleanor was conscious must have been procured by some theft or contrivance unknown to herself. She was not in a humor, however, to regard it as an affront, and affecting to take no notice of what passed, by instantly talking of something else, she internally resolved henceforward to catch every opportunity of eyeing the hair and of satisfying herself beyond all doubt that it was exactly the shade of her own. So could it be Eleanor's hair? Marian thinks it's Eleanor's hair and that they were both a bit shy because they didn't want to say it in the open. But Eleanor knows that she did not give a lock of her hair to Edward. But it looks like her hair, and she thinks it's her hair, so then he must have stolen it. So now she needs proof, beyond all doubt, very pragmatic. She needs proof that it is exactly the shade of her own hair. Edward's embarrassment lasted some time, and it ended in an absence of mind still more settled. He was particularly grave the whole morning. Marianne severely censured herself for what she had said, but her own forgiveness might have been more speedy had she known how little offense it had given her sister. Before the middle of the day, they were visited by Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, who, having heard of the arrival of a gentleman at the cottage, came to take a survey of the guest. The two gossipers, the two curious ones. With the assistance of his mother in law, Sir John was not long in discovering that the name of Ferrars began with the letter F. And this prepared a future mine of raillery against the devoted Eleanor, which nothing but the newness of their acquaintance with Edward could have prevented from being immediately sprung. But as it was, she only learned from some very significant looks how far their penetration, founded on Margaret's instructions, extended. Remember that Margaret, the youngest sister, had said that Eleanor's love interest starts with the letter F. So when they come to Barton Cottage to see this new gentleman, they learn that his name is Edward Ferrars, and that Ferrars starts with F. So they're ready to start mocking Eleanor, but not just yet because they don't feel comfortable doing that in front of their new acquaintance, Edward. Sir John never came to the Dashwoods without either inviting them to dine at the park the next day or to drink tea with them that evening. On the present occasion, for the better entertainment of their visitor, towards whose amusement he felt himself bound to contribute, he wished to engage them for both. You must drink tea with us tonight, said he, for we shall be quite alone, and tomorrow you must absolutely dine with us, for we shall be a large party. Mrs. Jennings enforced the necessity. And who knows but you may raise a dance, said she, and that will tempt you, Miss Marian. A dance, cried Marian. Impossible. Who's to dance? Who? Why, yourselves and the Careys and Whitakers, to be sure. What, you thought nobody could dance because a certain person that shall be nameless is gone? I wish with all my soul, cried Sir John, that Willoughby were among us again. That nameless person, the one that shall not be named, he says it right away, that Willoughby were among us. This, and Marian's blushing, gave new suspicions to Edward. And who is Willoughby? Said he in a low voice to Miss Dashwood, by whom he was sitting. She gave him a brief reply. Marian's countenance was more communicative. Edward saw enough to comprehend, not only the meaning of others, but such of Marian's expressions as had puzzled him before. And when their visitors left them, he went immediately round to her and said in a whisper, I have been guessing. Shall I tell you my guess? What do you mean? Shall I tell you? Certainly. Well, then, I guess that Mr. Willoughby hunts. Marianne was surprised and confused, yet she could not help smiling at the quiet archness of his manner, and after a moment's silence said, "Oh, Edward, how can you? But the time will come, I hope. I'm sure you will like him." So it's they have such an interesting relationship, Edward and Marianne. Together, they are more relaxed to one another because they don't feel anything um, except for they like each other, but not more than that. And affection because the Edward likes his sister, Edward likes her sister, and Marianne likes that her sister likes Edward. You know what I mean? um, and he knows a lot about Marianne, so he says, "Well, if she likes this guy, so he probably hunts because her ideal of a lover must definitely hunt." And he was right. "I do not doubt it," replied he, rather astonished at her earnestness and warmth, for had he not imagined it to be a joke for the good of her acquaintance in general, founded only on a something or a nothing between Mr. Willoughby and herself, he would not have ventured to mention it. And this is the end of chapter 18. So you see how Eleanor and Edward continue to talk indirectly. They don't speak to each other, but through others. The different appreciations of nature. So Edward's agricultural point of view focused on the utility of nature, Marianne's picturesque admiration of nature, and Willoughby's passion for hunting, so a male dominion of nature. And what is important is that in this chapter is the fact that Marianne sees a ring on Edward's finger, and there's a lock of hair in it. And could it be Eleanor's hair, and what does it mean? Um, Megan says, "As a writer, I feel the sarcasm from Jane Austen's side about the letter F. It must be Edward Ferrars and everybody magically linking it. Jane Austen is just like, well, duh, obviously it is him." Yes. And it's such a childish thing to say, right? I cannot say any more, but all I will say is that it starts with the letter F. And then, of course, it must be him. Who else, right? Michelle says, enjoy the back and forth between Edward and Mary and very entertaining. I really like their dynamic because I feel like they feel they can be themselves with one another because they don't want to show off or to act in a certain way, has to be proper, or that they have second other meanings involved. They don't want the other to think better of them. They're just themselves with each other, so they can be very natural. In the same way as Eleanor feels at ease with Colonel Brandon, so they also feel a good dynamic there. Very good. So let's start with chapter 19. Edward remained a week at the cottage. He was earnestly pressed by Mrs. Dashwood to stay longer. But as if he were bent only on self-mortification, he seemed resolved to be gone when his enjoyment among his friends was at the height. His spirits during the last 2 or 3 days, though still very unequal, were greatly improved. He grew more and more partial to the house and environs, never spoke of going away without a sigh, declared his time to be wholly disengaged, even doubted to what place he should go when he left them, but still go he must. Never had any week passed so quickly. He could hardly believe it to be gone. He said so repeatedly. Other things he said too, which marked the turn of his feelings and gave the lie to his actions. He had no pleasure at Norland. He detested being in town, but either to Norland or London he must go. He valued their kindness beyond anything, and his greatest happiness was in being with them. Yet he must leave them at the end of a week, in spite of their wishes and his own, and without any restraint on his time. He puts boundaries for himself. He wishes to stay, but he thinks that duty commands him to go. So there's a big clash between his desire and the sense of duty in Edward, and he always chooses for duty. Like Eleanor, Marianne would probably choose for her own desire. Eleanor placed all that was astonishing in this way of acting to his mother's account. And it was happy for her that he had a mother whose character was so imperfectly known to her as to be the general excuse for everything strange on the part of her son. Disappointed, however, and vexed as she was, and sometimes displeased with his uncertain behavior to herself, she was very well disposed on the whole to regard his actions with all the candid allowances and generous qualifications which had been rather more painfully extorted from her from Willoughby service by her mother. His want of spirits, of openness, and of consistency were most usually attributed to his want of independence, and his better knowledge of Mrs. Ferrars's dispositions and designs. The shortness of his visit, the steadiness of his purpose in leaving them, originated in the same fettered inclination, the same inevitable necessity of temporizing with his mother. The old, well established grievance of duty against will, parent against child, was the cause of all. So Eleanor tries to rationalize Edward's departure, as she always does. She tries to rationalize everything. And she concludes, well, must be his mother. So he must have to go because of his mother's wishes. She would have been glad to know when these difficulties were to cease, this opposition was to yield, when Mrs. Ferrars would be reformed and her son be at liberty to be happy. But from such vain wishes she was forced to turn for comfort to the renewal of her confidence in Edward's affection, to the remembrance of every mark of regard in look or word which fell from him while at Barton, and above all to that flattering proof of it which he constantly wore around his finger. "I think, Edward," said Mrs. Dashwood, as they were at breakfast the last morning, "you would be a happier man if you had any profession to engage your time and give an interest to your plans and actions. Some inconvenience to your friends, indeed, might result from it. You would not be able to give them so much of your time, but," with a smile, "you would be materially benefited in one particular at least. You would know where to go when you left them." "I do assure you," he replied, "that I have long thought on this point as you think now. It has been and is and probably will always be a heavy misfortune to me that I have had no necessary business to engage me, no profession to give me employment or afford me anything like independence." So Edward has nothing to do. He's not the oldest son, so he's not to inherit the family's property. So he has fewer responsibilities as well, but he doesn't really know what to do with his life. He has no purpose, he has no profession. And he wished he had something that he could do to, keep his mind busy, to give him a purpose, to have to so that he has somewhere to go. He doesn't even know where to go now. He spends some days here, some days there, visiting relatives, visiting friends, and he does not have any independence. Also no financial independence. He depends on his mother. So he has to bind to his mother's wishes. This is a very interesting part, how Edward talks about his position as not a firstborn son. "But unfortunately, my own nicety and the nicety of my friends have made me what I am, an idle, helpless being. We never could agree in our choice of a profession. I always preferred the church, as I still do, but that was not smart enough for my family. They recommended the army. That was a great deal too smart for me. The law was allowed to be genteel enough. Many young men who had chambers in the temple made a very good appearance in the first circles and drove about town in very knowing gigs, kind of, kind of a carriage. But I had no inclination for the law, even in this less abstruse study of it, which my family approved. As for the navy, it had fashion on its side, but I was too old when the subject was first started to enter it. And at length, as there was no necessity for my having any profession at all, as I might be as dashing and expensive without a red coat on my back as with one, idleness was pronounced on the whole to be the most advantageous and honorable, and a young man of 18 is not in general so earnestly bent on being busy as to resist the solicitations of his friends to do nothing. I was therefore entered at Oxford and have been properly idle ever since. So it's Of course, his concerns are very topical from early 19th century society because he comes from a rich family, so he doesn't really need to worry about money, but he cannot use the money from his family as he wishes. But he has a comfortable lifestyle and he has nothing to do, and he wishes he had something to do. He wanted to be part of the church, he wanted to be a vicar, priest, a cleric, but that is not a profession that his family approves because it's not s- smart enough. So he could be a lawyer, he could go to the army, he could go to the navy. All those professions would be accepted by his family, but he doesn't want that. So we can identify with that as well. Of course, our context is different, but young people in the 21st century also struggle with that, with wanting to do something with their lives and that something not being approved by their families. Um, so how can he solve this problem? So the sense of will against duty. So he really wants to do something else, but he does not want to to cause friction in his family, right? There is a very interesting footnote here on page 461 about the professions. Each profession evaluated by Edward's family in accord with its fashionable status. So for his family, it only mattered how fashionable that profession would be, not how useful or how pleasant it would be. Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park agrees with the Ferrers women in favoring the army and navy and in deprecating the church. She said in Mansfield Park, soldiers and sailors are always acceptable in society. Nobody can wonder that men are soldiers and sailors. The army, the guards, most likely a great deal too smart for Edward, would give access to London's most exclusive society, its gentlemen's clubs, ballrooms, and the homes of the rich, famous, and powerful. His chance for the Navy had passed. Jane Austen's brothers entered the Royal Navy Academy at Portsmouth at around 12 years of age, and Edward is already past that age. Um, the law, not to Edward's taste, provides less fashion, but enough to satisfy his mother and sister. The church, his choice, provides no fashion at all. Michelle says duty versus will, sense versus sensibility. Yes, you see how this novel is made up with so many contrasts, so many oppositions, right? Um, and that's this whole skeleton of this book, and it's quite interesting. And then there's also a very interesting information about Oxford University. So we have a very different image of Oxford University now. What did it mean for Edward to go to Oxford back then? Possibly an allusion to the most fashionable and idle rank of Oxford students at the time, the status of a gentleman commoner, a university position free of exams and normal college discipline, and after 3 years of residence, terminating in an honorary master's degree. The examinations throughout the university were notoriously lax. Edward's remark on being idle reflects the opinions of contemporary satirists in alluding to a general slackness at Oxford. This is a quote from the Edinburgh Review. Sad indeed is the fate of this university if its object has been classical literature alone, and it has failed even in that. So I did not know about this, but there was this option for rich men, only men could attend the university at the time, right? For rich men to attend Oxford as, what's it called again? Gentlemen commoners. So they would go to university, but they would not need to take any exams. Everything was very lax, easygoing. And after 3 years, they would get an honorary MA. Of course, he brought money to the institution, so that was good for the institution. But it doesn't mean that an Oxford student, rich Oxford student from the early 19th century, that he was a very educated person. That's quite interesting, right? So he says he went to Oxford to be idle. Mm, The consequence of which, I suppose, will be, said Mrs. Dashwood, since leisure has not promoted your own happiness, that your sons will be brought up to as many pursuits, employments, professions, and trades as Columella's. They will be brought up, said he in a serious accent, to be as unlike myself as is possible, in feeling, in action, in condition, in everything. And that's so sad. He says that when he has children, he wants them to have a different life, completely different life, in feeling, in action, in condition, in everything. So it says plainly here that he's not happy, and that's very, very sad. And mainly because of his family's intermission, right? Come, come, this is all a diffusion of immediate want of spirits, Edward. You are in a melancholy humor, and fancy that any one unlike yourself must be happy. But remember that the pain of parting from friends will be felt by everybody at times, whatever be their education or state. Mrs. Dashwood is so nice, right? Know your own happiness. And look at this. Look at what Mrs. Dashwood says. Know your own happiness. You want nothing but patience, or give it a more fascinating name, call it hope. Your mother will secure to you in time that independence you are so anxious for. It is her duty, and it must ere long become her happiness to prevent your whole youth from being wasted in discontent. How much may not a few months do? She's such a good parent. I think, replied Edward, that I may defy many months to produce any good to me. This desponding turn of mind, though it could not be communicated to Mrs. Dashwood, gave additional pain to them all in the parting, which shortly took place, and left an uncomfortable impression on Elinor's feelings especially, which required some trouble and time to subdue. But as it was her determination to subdue it, Elinor is always determined to subdue her feelings, and to prevent herself from appearing to suffer more than what all her family suffered from appearing than what all her family suffered on his going away. She did not adopt the method so judiciously exploited by Marianne on a similar occasion to augment and fix her sorrow by seeking silence, solitude, and idleness. Their means were as different as their objects, and equally suited to the advancements of each. So Edward is gone, but Eleanor is going to handle the situation very differently from Marianne. She's not going to augment her suffering by doing what Marianne did, seeking silence, solitude, and idleness. She's doing the complete opposite. Eleanor sat down to her drawing table as soon as he was out of the house, busily employed herself the whole day, neither sought nor avoided the mention of his name, appeared to interest herself almost as much as ever in the general concerns of the family, and if by this conduct she did not lessen her own grief, it was at least prevented from unnecessary increase, and her mother and sisters were spared much solitude on her account. So while Marianne was seeking solitude, silence, and to feel the feelings, to feel the mourning period, Eleanor sets herself to employments. She works all day. So she draws, she reads, she keeps herself busy. Employment as the antidote of sorrow. And both reactions are bad. Both Marianne's overindulgence of feelings and Eleanor's self-denial and denial of feelings altogether, they're both bad, both extremes. So both sisters need to learn to find a balance. Megan says, when I used to teach, I saw even in the richer schools how parents just send their kids there, open the path to university, just for some of them to drop out, become depressed because of what the family wants and the pressure of society. Exactly. This happens in the 21st century, and it happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. So even though this book was written over 200 years ago, we can identify with what Edward's going through. Of course, different contexts, but the essence of the feeling is the same. And that is very interesting. That's the power of literature, right? To connect us with people, either real or imaginary fictional characters that lived hundreds of years ago. So he left, right? And Eleanor is busy as a bee. Such behavior as this, so exactly the reverse of her own, appeared no more meritorious to Marianne than her own had seemed faulty to her. The business of self command she settled very easily. With strong affections, it was impossible. With calm ones, it would have no merit. That her sister's affections were calm, she dared not deny, though she blushed to acknowledge it. And of the strength of her own, she gave a very striking proof by still loving and respecting that sister in spite of this mortifying conviction. Without shutting herself up from her family, or leaving the house in determined solitude to avoid them, or laying awake the whole night to indulge meditation, Eleanor found every day afforded her leisure enough to think of Edward and of Edward's behavior in every possible variety which the different state of her spirits at different times could produce, with tenderness, pity, approbation, censure, and doubt. There were moments in abundance when, if not by the absence of her mother and sisters, at least by the nature of their employments, conversation was forbidden among them, and every effect of solitude was produced. Her mind was inevitably at liberty. Her thoughts could not be chained elsewhere, and the past and the future, on a subject so interesting, must be before her, must force her attention, and engross her memory, her reflection, and her fancy. From a reverie of this kind, as she sat at her drawing table, she was roused one morning soon after Edward's leaving them by the arrival of company. So again, Edward leaves, but new people arrive. She happened to be quite alone. The closing of the little gate at the entrance of the green court in front of the house drew her eyes to the window, and she saw a large party walking up to the door. Amongst them were Sir John and Lady Middleton and Mrs. Jennings, but there were two others, a gentleman and lady, who were quite unknown to her. She was sitting near the window, and as soon as Sir John perceived her, he left the rest of the party to the ceremony of knocking at the door, and stepping across the turf, obliged her to open the casement to speak to him, though the space was so short between the door and the window as to make it hardly possible to speak at one without being heard at the other. This is so funny. So Sir John wants to talk to Eleanor before the others arrive. So while the others are knocking at the door, he goes and opens the window to talk to her in private. But the window is so close to the door that the others would probably hear it anyway. Well, said he, we have brought you some strangers. How do you like them? Hush, they will hear you. Never mind if they do. It is only the Palmers. Charlotte is very pretty, I can tell you. You may see her if you look this way. As Eleanor was certain of seeing her in a couple of minutes, without taking that liberty of looking directly at her, she begged to be excused. Where is Marianne? Has she run away because we are come? I see her instrument is open. She is walking, I believe. They were now joined by Mrs. Jennings, who had not patience enough to wait till the door was open before she told her story. So I can just imagine Mrs. Jennings arriving. She doesn't even wait for the door to close. She starts telling the story because she wants to say it first. She came hallooing to the window. How do you do, my dear? How does Mrs. Dashwood do? And where are your sisters? What, all alone? You will be glad of a little company to sit with you. I have brought my other son and daughter to see you. Only think of their coming so suddenly. I thought I heard a carriage last night while we were drinking our tea, but it never entered my head that it could be them. I thought of nothing but whether it might not be Colonel Brandon come back again. So I said to Sir John, I do think I hear a carriage. Perhaps it is Colonel Brandon come back again. Eleanor was obliged to turn from her in the middle of her story to receive the rest of the party. Lady Middleton introduced the two strangers. Mrs. Dashwood and Margaret came downstairs at the same time, and they all sat down to look at one another, while Mrs. Jennings continued her story as she walked through the passage into the parlor, attended by Sir John. Megan says, reminds me of where Bilbo peeks through the window and stares Gandalf right in the eye. This is how I imagine the scene. Yes, indeed. That's an interesting association. I love this comic um, um, intervals, this comic intervals here. So we ended chapter 18 with a very serious tone. Um, so with Edward leaving, Eleanor said, "But now this group of people arrive and everything is upside down and there's gossip going all over the place." And let's see how it continues. Mrs. Palmer, so that is the other daughter of Mrs. Jennings, so Lady Middleton's sister. Mrs. Palmer was several years younger than Lady Middleton and totally unlike her in every respect. She was short and plump, had a pretty face, and the finest expression of good humor in it that could possibly be. Her manners were by no means so elegant as her sister's, but they were much more prepossessing. She came in with a smile, smiled all the time of her visit, except when she left, and smiled when she went away. See how the narrator here repeats smile, smile, laugh, smile? So there's an exaggeration of smiles that makes you wonder if those smiles are genuine. And in contrast, her husband was a grave looking young man of 5 or 6 and 20, with an air of more fashion and sense than his wife, but of less willingness to please or be pleased. A grave looking young man of 26 years old. Nowadays, 26 years old is still a youngster, right? And there was already a man, a married man, father, um, how to say that, the head of a family. Um, he entered the room with a look of self consequence, slightly bowed to the ladies without speaking a word, and after briefly surveying them in their apartments, took up a newspaper from the table and continued to read it as long as he stayed. Mrs. Palmer, on the contrary, who was strongly endowed by nature with a turn for being uniformly civil and happy, was hardly seated before her admiration of the parlor and everything in it burst forth. She didn't even have time to look around. She's already saying, "Well, what a delightful room this is. I never saw anything so charming. Only think, Mamma, how it is improved since I was here last. I always thought it such a sweet place, ma'am," turning to Mrs. Dashwood. "But you have made it so charming. Only look, sister, how delightful everything is. How I should like such a house for myself. Should not you, Mr. Palmer?" Mr. Palmer made her no answer, and did not even raise his eyes from the newspaper. "Mr. Palmer does not hear me," said she, laughing. "He never does sometimes. It is so ridiculous." This was quite a new idea to Mrs. Dashwood. She had never been used to find wit in the inattention of anyone, and could not help looking with surprise at them both. Mrs. Jennings in the meantime talked on as loud as she could, and continued her account of their surprise the evening before on seeing their friends without ceasing till everything was told. Mrs. Palmer laughed heartily at the recollection of their astonishment, and everybody agreed 2 or 3 times over that it had been quite an agreeable surprise. "You may believe how glad we all were to see them," added Mrs. Jennings, leaning forwards towards Eleanor and speaking in a low voice as if she meant to be heard by no one else, though they were seated on different sides of the room. "But, however, I can't help wishing they had not travelled quite so fast, nor made such a long journey of it, for they came all round by London upon account of some business, for, you know," nodding significantly and pointing to her daughter, "it was wrong in her situation. I wanted her to stay at home and rest this morning, but she would come with us. She longed so much to see you all." Mrs. Palmer laughed and said it would not do her any harm. "She expects to be confined in February," continued Mrs. Jennings. So her situation, Mrs. Palmer's situation, is that she's pregnant and she's to be confined in February, meaning she's to give birth, to be confined. So when women gave birth at the time, they would be confined for a number of weeks in the house, to have the baby and all. So she expects to be confined in February. But that was a very private matter. They would not speak openly about this according to the social conventions of the time, but Mrs. Jennings, we know her. So she says it right away, right? And pointing, right? Because, you know, in her condition. um, Lady Middleton could no longer endure such a conversation, and therefore exerted herself to ask Mr. Palmer if there was any news in the paper. "No, none at all," he replied, and read on. Here comes Marianne, cried Sir John. Now, Palmer, you should see a monstrous pretty girl. He immediately went into the passage, opened the front door, and ushered her in himself. Mrs. Jennings asked her as soon as she appeared if she had not been to Allenham, gossip, and Mrs. Palmer laughed so heartily at the question as to show she understood it, meaning Mrs. Jennings already told them everything. Mr. Palmer looked up on her entering the room, stared at her some minutes, and then returned to his newspaper. Mrs. Palmer's eye was now caught by the drawings which hung round the room. She got up to examine them. "Oh dear, how beautiful these are! Well, how delightful! Do but look, mamma, how sweet! I declare they are quite charming. I could look at them forever." The exaggeration. And then, sitting down again, she very soon forgot that there were any such things in the room. The sarcasm of the narrator. So, the contrast between what she says, "Oh, look at these paintings, these drawings, I could look at them forever," and the narrator's comment that she sat down and soon forgot that they even existed. Megan says, interesting, when you play seems medieval. If your monarch is a queen, the game basically stops. She goes to the castle and is confined. Rather annoying because you skip responsibilities and then your sims get cranky. Well, that's interesting, but quite historically accurate because, so if the queen was pregnant, she would be confined. All women would be confined. And there were so many birth complications at the time. That it was very important for the women to just rest, and other women from the family would come to help them out. So, for instance, Jane Austen had 6 brothers, 7 brothers, a lot of brothers. So she had a lot of sisters in law. And whenever some of them had babies and would be confined in their houses, Jane would be required to go to their brother's house to help with the housekeeping and help with the sister-in-law while they were confined. So they really were quite isolated from society for about 2 months or so. And Mr. Palmer is terrible. He only reads his newspaper. He doesn't even look up. When Lady Middleton rose to go away, Mr. Palmer rose also, laid down the newspaper, stretched himself, and looked at them all round. "My love, have you been asleep?" said his wife, laughing. Asleep is a funny word, right? He was not asleep, but it feels as if he's asleep through his whole marriage, right? Um, it seems like he's just aloof all the time to try to escape his own marriage, which is very sad. And Mrs. Palmer, of course, she sees it all and she understands it all, but she pretends not to. And so she exaggerates in her happiness. So she laughs all the time, she smiles all the time. But it's all fake. And it's so sad to see this relationship, this couple, right? Um, so she asks, "Have you been asleep, my love?" He made her no answer and only observed, after again examining the room, that it was very low pitched and that the ceiling was crooked. He then made his bow and departed with the rest. Misha says that some religions still practice confinement, for example, Islam. Well, that's very interesting. So they still keep some of these old traditions, right? In more, let's say, conservative families. Sir John had been very urgent with them all to spend the next day at the park. Mrs. Dashwood, who did not choose to dine with them oftener than they dined at the cottage, absolutely refused on her own account. Her daughters might do as they pleased, but they had no curiosity to see how Mr. and Mrs. Palmer ate their dinner, and no expectation of pleasure from them in any other way. They attempted, therefore, likewise to excuse themselves, but the weather was uncertain and not likely to be good. But Sir John would not be satisfied, and the carriage should be sent for them, and they must come. Lady Middleton, too, though she did not press their mother, pressed them. Mrs. Jennings and Mrs. Palmer joined their entreaties. All seemed equally anxious to avoid a family party, and the young ladies were obliged to yield. "Why should they ask us?" said Marianne as soon as they were gone. The rent of this cottage is said to be low, but we have it on very hard terms if we are to dine at the park whenever anyone is staying either with them or with us. They mean no less to be civil and kind to us now, said Eleanor, by these frequent invitations than by those which we received from them a few weeks ago. The alteration is not in them if their parties are grown tedious and dull. We must look for the change elsewhere. Uh, I wanted to say, oh, yes, because Sir John and Mrs. Jennings keep using the word must for the girls. You must do this, you must do that, you must go there, you must talk, you must do. And single ladies would usually be carried around as others pleased, and they did not have much of a choice. So they would be sent, for example, like I said, they would be sent to help a sister-in-law with a baby. They would be sent to make company to an older aunt. They would be sent somewhere else, and they had no choice. They could not, unless they had a very good excuse or very good parents, like Eleanor and Marian have a very nice parent. They had to yield. So this is the end of chapter 19. So Edward leaves. There is the battle between his desires and his sense of duty. Eleanor's different reaction to the departure of her beloved one. Instead of wandering on her own and seeking solitude and seeking feelings, she sets herself for employment as the antidote of sorrow. And there are the new characters, Mr. Palmer, who's always reading or doing something else, always aloof to escape his own marriage, and Mrs. Palmer, who's Mrs. Jennings' other daughter, and the exaggeration of her um, actions, of her speeches, of her laughter, of her smile. She smiles all the time, too sadly enough, to cover her own sadness. So she comes across as a very shallow, silly woman, but I think she's a complex character. She's not, well, we're going to read more about them in chapter 20, but she's not silly. She's pretty smart. She knows what she's doing, but she perhaps trying to fool her own self into thinking that she's happier than she actually is. And that is very, very sad. Okay, let's continue with chapter 20. As the Miss Dashwoods entered the drawing room of the park the next day, at one door Mrs. Palmer came running. As the Miss Dashwoods entered at one door, Mrs. Palmer came running in at the other, looking as good-humored and merry as before. She took them all most affectionately by the hand and expressed great delight in seeing them again. "I'm so glad to see you," said she, seating herself between Eleanor and Marian. "For it is so bad a day I was afraid you might not come, which would be a shocking thing as we go again tomorrow. We must go, for the Westons came to us next week, you know. Come to us next week, you know. It was quite a sudden thing your coming at all, and I knew nothing of it till the carriage was coming to the door, and then Mr. Palmer asked me if I would go with him to Barton. He is so droll, he never tells me anything." Well, that's not funny at all, right? You see what she's doing to protect herself, to shield herself from the unhappiness of her marriage as well. They're both unhappy. "I'm so sorry we cannot stay longer. However, we shall meet again in town very soon, I hope." They were obliged to put an end to such an expectation. "Not go to town?" cried Mrs. Palmer, with a laugh. "I shall be quite disappointed if you do not. I could get the nicest house in the world for you, next door to ours, in Hanover Square. You must come, indeed. I am sure I shall be very happy to chaperon you at any time till I am confined, if Mrs. Dashwood should not like to go into public." As unmarried ladies, Marian and Eleanor could not go anywhere alone, unchaperoned. So they needed another woman to, or a member of the family, like a father or brother, to escort them. And she's talking about going to town, and she's shocked about the Dashwoods not going. And let's see why. This is an interesting note for 6.3. Not go to town. For the London season, an expensive social ritual engaged in by the land owning classes, lasting from February through July, for parliament, parties, balls, shopping, and for the opportunity to secure appropriate marriages. In Persuasion, Sir Walter and Elizabeth go to town until they can no longer afford it. In Sense and Sensibility, the John Dashwood's acquisition of the Norland fortune makes possible their first attempt at the season. So the London season lasts from February to July, and everyone that matters is in London. And all the parties or the social activities happen there. So each period of the year, the gentry was supposed to be uh, in some place specifically. And their address, so what Mrs. Palmer says, their address says a lot about their financial situation. She says, next door to ours in Hanover Square. Now, this is an expensive address, suiting Mr. Palmer's self indulgent tastes for fashion. Hanover Square lies in Mayfair, the most exclusive residential area of Regency London, an address only a shade less in status and fashion than Mayfair's two other squares, Grosvenor Square and Berkeley Square, due to its greater distance from Hyde Park. So they're very well off, they're very wealthy, Mr. and Mrs. Palmer. It shows by their address in London. And they would be willing to take the Dashwood sisters, but they do not want to. They thanked her, but were obliged to resist all her entreaties. Oh, my love, cried Mrs. Palmer to her husband, who just then entered the room. You must help me to persuade the Miss Dashwoods to go to town this winter. Her love made no answer. Look at the sarcastic narrator. Her love made no answer. And after slightly bowing to the ladies, began complaining of the weather. How horrid all this is, said he. Such weather makes everything and everybody disgusting. Dullness is as much produced within doors as without by rain. It makes one detest all one's acquaintance. What the devil does Sir John mean by not having a billiard room in this house? How few people know what comfort is. Sir John is as stupid as the weather. The rest of the company soon dropped in. I am afraid, Miss Marianne, said Sir John, you have not been able to take your usual walk to Allenham today. They don't let it go. Marianne looked very grave and said nothing. Oh, don't be so sly before us, said Mrs. Palmer, for we know all about it, I assure you, and I admire your taste very much, for I think he is extremely handsome. We do not live a great way from him in the country, you know, not above 10 miles, I dare say. Much nearer 30, said her husband. Ah, well, there is not much difference. I never was at his house, but they say it is a sweet, pretty place. As vile a spot as I ever saw in my life, said Mr. Palmer. He's such a negative man. He's a terrible man. Terrible man. Marianne remained perfectly silent, though her countenance betrayed her interest in what was said. Is it very ugly? Continued Mrs. Palmer. Then it must be some other place that is so pretty, I suppose. When they were seated in the dining room, Sir John observed with regret that they were only 8 altogether. My dear, said he to his lady, it is very provoking that we should be so few. Why did not you ask the Gilberts to come to us today? Did not I tell you, Sir John, when you spoke to me about it before, that it could not be done? They dined with us last. You and I, Sir John, said Mrs. Jennings, should not stand upon such ceremony. Then you would be very ill-bred, cried Mr. Palmer. My love, you contradict everybody, said his wife with her usual laugh. Do you know that you are quite rude? She uses extra politeness here. You know, my love, do you know that you're quite rude, super rude, quite rude? So extra politeness and laughing and smiles to compensate for the truth that they're both unhappy. I did not know I contradicted anybody in calling your mother ill-bred. Ah, you may abuse me as you please, said the good-natured old lady. You have taken Charlotte off my hands and cannot give her back again, so there I have the whip hand of you. Charlotte laughed heartily to think that her husband could not get rid of her, and exultingly said she did not care how cross he was to her, as they must live together. Now, does she not care, in truth? Does she really not care? It was impossible for anyone to be more truly good natured or more determined to be happy than Mrs. Palmer. The studied indifference, insolence, and discontent of her husband gave her no pain, and when he scolded or abused her, she was highly diverted. Mr. Palmer is so droll, said she in a whisper to Eleanor. He is always out of humor. Oh, this hurts me. It is so painful. I mean, so sad. It apparently gave her no pain, but I'm sure it did. And Mrs. Palmer, look at the words, was more determined. There was no one more determined to be happy than Mrs. Palmer. She was determined to be happy rather than being actually happy. You see the difference? So she's quite a strong woman. Eleanor was not inclined, after a little observation, to give him credit for being so genuinely and unaffectedly ill natured or ill bred as he wished to appear. His temper might perhaps be a little soured by finding, like many others of his sex, that through some unaccountable bias in favor of beauty, he was the husband of a very silly woman. But she knew that this kind of blunder was too common for any sensible man to be lastingly hurt by it. It was rather a wish of distinction, she believed, which produced his contemptuous treatment of everybody and his general abuse of everything before him. It was the desire of appearing superior to other people. The motive was too common to be wondered at, but the means, however they might succeed by establishing his superiority in ill breeding, were not likely to attach any one to him except his wife. "Oh, my dear Miss Dashwood," said Mrs. Palmer soon afterwards, "I have got such a favor to ask of you and your sister. Will you come and spend some time at Cleveland this Christmas? Now pray do, and come while the Westons are with us. You cannot think how happy I shall be. It will be quite delightful. My love," applying to her husband, "don't you long to have the Miss Dashwoods come to Cleveland?" "Certainly," he replied with a sneer. "I came into Devonshire with no other view." "There now," said his lady. So she completely ignores the sarcasm in his voice. "Certainly. There now," said his lady. "You see, Mr. Palmer expects you, so you cannot refuse to come." They both eagerly and resolutely declined her invitation. "But indeed you must and shall come. I am sure you will like it of all things. The Westons will be with us, and it will be quite delightful. You cannot think what a sweet place Cleveland is. And we are so gay now, for Mr. Palmer is always going about the country canvassing against the election, and so many people come to dine with us that I never saw before. It is quite charming. But, poor fellow, it is very fatiguing to him, for he is forced to make everybody like him." Yeah, right, as if anyone could ever like Mr. Palmer. Eleanor could hardly keep her countenance as she assented to the hardship of such an obligation. "How charming it will be," said Charlotte, "when he is in Parliament, won't it? How I shall laugh! It will be so ridiculous to see all his letters directed to him with an MP. But do you know, he says he will never frank for me. He declares he won't. Don't you, Mr. Palmer?" Mr. Palmer took no notice of her. "He cannot bear writing, you know," she continued. "He says it is quite shocking." "No," said he, "I never said anything so irrational. Don't palm all your abuses of language upon me." There now, you see how droll he is. Whenever he's rude, she does that, right? You see how droll he is. This is always the way with him. Sometimes he won't speak to me for half a day together, and then he comes out with something so droll, all about anything in the world. She makes it sound funny, but it's not funny at all, right? It's very sad. She surprised Eleanor very much as they returned into the drawing room by asking her whether she did not like Mr. Palmer excessively. "Certainly," said Eleanor. "He seems very agreeable." "Well, I am so glad you do. I thought you would. He is so pleasant. And Mr. Palmer is excessively pleased with you and your sisters, I can tell you. And you can think how disappointed he will be if you don't come to Cleveland. I can't imagine why you should object to it." Eleanor was again obliged to decline her invitation, and by changing the subject, put a stop to her entreaties. She thought it probable that as they lived in the same county, Mrs. Palmer might be able to give some more particular account of Willoughby's general character than could be gathered from the Middletons' partial acquaintance with him, and she was eager to gain from any one such a confirmation of his merits as might remove the possibility of fear for Marianne. She began by inquiring if they saw much of Mr. Willoughby at Cleveland, and whether they were intimately acquainted with him. Megan says, I wonder if this was how Jane Austen actually felt at the stage of her life. There is a sadness that comes across so strong with the conversation between the two. Yes, it's so sad. It's so sad and painful to read, but it's covered with this exaggerated politeness, exaggerated laughter, fake smiles all over. And yeah, we can only wonder if it is uh, you know, part of, or at least resembles, what Jane Austen herself felt. Um, so now Eleanor, well, they don't like the Palmers, but Eleanor thinks this might be a good idea, a good chance to know more about Willoughby, since she said that they live close to him in the country. So this is also funny. See how um, Jane Austen here mocks the use of the word excessively. Oh dear, yes, I know him extremely well, replied Mrs. Palmer. Not that I ever spoke to him, indeed, but I have seen him forever in town. Somehow or other, I never happened to be staying at Barton while he was at Allenham. Mamma saw him here once before, but I was with my uncle at Weymouth. However, I dare say we should have seen a great deal of him in Somersetshire, if it had not happened very unluckily that we should never have been in the country together. He's very little at Combe, I believe, but if he were ever so much there, I do not think Mr. Palmer would visit him, for he is in the opposition, you know. And besides, it is such a way off. I know why you inquire about him very well. Your sister is to marry him. I am monstrous glad of it, for then I shall have her for a neighbor, you know. So she says she knows him extremely well, but they've never seen each other, in fact. So, in conclusion, she knows nothing about Willoughby, although she says she knows him extremely well. Upon my word, replied Eleanor, you know much more of the matter than I do, if you have any reason to expect such a match. Don't pretend to deny it, because you know it is what everybody talks of. I assure you I heard of it in my way through town. My dear Mrs. Palmer, upon my honor, I did. I met Colonel Brandon Monday morning in Bond Street, just before we left town, and he told me of it directly. Bond Street was a very fashionable shopping street, so it also attests to the Palmers' wealth. Now, Eleanor says, you surprise me very much. Colonel Brandon tell you of it. Surely you must be mistaken. To give such intelligence to a person who could not be interested in it, even if it were true, is not what I should expect Colonel Brandon to do. But I do assure you it was so for all that, and I will tell you how it happened. When we met him, he turned back and walked with us, and so we began talking of my brother and sister, and one thing and another, and I said to him, so, Colonel, and there is a new family come to Barton Cottage, I hear, and Mamma sends me word they are very pretty, and that one of them is going to be married to Mr. Willoughby of Combe Magna. Is it true, pray? For of course you must know, as you have been in Devonshire so lately. So it was not Colonel Brandon that said so. It was her who told Colonel Brandon and asked if it was true. And what did the colonel say? Oh, he did not say much, but he looked as if he knew it to be true, so that from that moment I set it down as certain. It will be quite delightful, I declare. When is it to take place? I love these conversations. Mr. Brandon was very well, I hope. Oh, yes, quite well, and so full of your praises. He did nothing but say fine things of you. I am flattered by his commendation. He seems an excellent man, and I think him uncommonly pleasing. So do I. He's such a charming man that it is quite a pity he should be so grave and so dull. Mamma says he was in love with your sister too. I assure you it was a great compliment if he was, for he hardly ever falls in love with anybody. Is Mr. Willoughby much known in your part of Somersetshire? Said Eleanor. Oh, yes, extremely well. That is, I do not believe people. I do not believe many people are acquainted with him because Com Magna is so far off, but all think him extremely agreeable, I assure you. Nobody is more liked than Mr. Willoughby wherever he goes, and so you may tell your sister. She's a monstrous lucky girl to get him, upon my honor. Not but that he's much more lucky in getting her because she's so very handsome and agreeable that nothing can be good enough for her. However, I don't think her hardly at all handsomer than you, I assure you, for I think you both excessively pretty, and so does Mr. Palmer too, I am sure, though we could not get him to own it last night. Oh, it's so funny. And she knows things all extremely well, although she doesn't know anything at all. Mrs. Palmer's information respecting Willoughby was not very material, not at all. But any testimony in his favor, however small, was pleasing to her. I am so glad we are got acquainted at last, continued Charlotte, and now I hope we shall always be great friends. You can't think how much I long to see you. She didn't even know she existed before, right? It is so delightful that you should live at the cottage. Nothing can be like it, to be sure. And I'm so glad your sister is going to be well married. I hope you will be a great deal at Combe Magna. It is a sweet place by all accounts. You have been long acquainted with Colonel Brandon, have you not? Yes, a great while, ever since my sister married. He was a particular friend of Sir John's. I believe, she added in a low voice, he would have been very glad to have had me, if he could. Sir John and Lady Middleton wished it very much, but Mamma did not think the match good enough for me. Otherwise, Sir John would have mentioned it to the colonel, and we should have been married immediately. Did not Colonel Brandon know of Sir John's proposal to your mother before it was made? Had he never owned his affection to yourself? Oh, no, but if Mamma had not objected to it, I dare say he would have liked it of all things. He had not seen me then above twice, for it was before I left school. However, I am much happier as I am. Mr. Palmer is just the kind of man I like. And the end of chapter. Do you see how wittily Austen does that? So this is the end of chapter 20. So in this chapter, the Dashwoods go to Barton Park to dine with the Palmers. We get to know this couple a little bit better. They are a very sad couple. They don't communicate, they don't understand each other, and they have different coping mechanisms. So Mrs. Palmer's coping mechanism is to deny anything bad is happening and to sugarcoat everything with exaggeration and extra politeness and smiles and laughter all the time. She's determined to be happy, although not actually happy. And Mr. Palmer's coping mechanism is rudeness and solitude. So he just does his own thing. So he reads the paper while the others are talking. He's just there. He complains about the weather. He complains about everything. So that's his coping mechanism. Um, Good. So let's take a look at the last chapter we're going to discuss today. This is going to be a bit of a longer session, so bear with me. So let's take a look at chapter 21. The Palmers returned to Cleveland the next day, and the two families at Barton were again left to entertain each other. But this did not last long. Eleanor had hardly got their last visitors out of her head, had hardly done wondering at Charlotte's being so happy without a cause, at Mr. Palmer's acting so simply in this case so foolishly, with good abilities, and at the strange unsuitableness which often existed between husband and wife, before Sir John's and Mrs. Jennings' active zeal in the cause of society procured her some other new acquaintance to see and observe. They can never be alone. Sir Middleton, John Middleton, always wants his house full, and 8 people are not enough people. So he goes looking for more people that he can bring home. In a morning's excursion to Exeter, a shopping city, they had met with 2 young ladies whom Mrs. Jennings had the satisfaction of discovering to be her relations, and this was enough for Sir John to invite them directly to the park as soon as their present engagements at Exeter were over. Their engagements at Exeter instantly gave way before such an invitation, and Lady Middleton was thrown into no little alarm on the return of Sir John by hearing that she was very soon to receive a visit from two girls whom she had never seen in her life, and of whose elegance, whose tolerable gentility even, she could have no proof. For the assurances of her husband and mother on that subject went for nothing at all. Their being her relations too made it so much the worse, and Mrs. Jennings' attempts at consolation were therefore unfortunately founded, when she advised her daughter not to care about their being so fashionable because they were all cousins and must put up with one another. In a way, they were all related, right? As it was impossible, however, now to prevent their coming, Lady Middleton resigned herself to the idea of it with all the philosophy of a well bred woman, contenting herself with merely giving her husband a gentle reprimand on the subject 5 or 6 times every day. The young ladies arrived. Their appearance was by no means ungenteel or unfashionable. Their dress was very smart, their manners very civil. They were delighted with the house and in raptures with the furniture, and they happened to be so dotingly fond of children that Lady Middleton's good opinion was engaged in their favor before they had been an hour at the park. She declared them to be very agreeable girls indeed, which for her ladyship was enthusiastic admiration. Sir John's confidence in his own judgment rose with this animated praise, and he set off directly for the cottage to tell the Miss Dashwoods of the Miss Steele's arrival, and to assure them of their being the sweetest girls in the world. From such commendation as this, however, there was not much to be learned. Eleanor well knew that the sweetest girls in the world were to be met with in every part of England, under every possible variation of form, face, temper, and understanding. Sir John wanted the whole family to walk to the park directly and look at his guests. Benevolent, philanthropic man, it was painful to him even to keep a third cousin to himself. The sarcasm, right? I mean, he does this, it doesn't mean any harm. He just wants people to have fun. But he forces people together, and that's not good. It was painful to him even to keep a third cousin to himself. He wants to share everyone. Do come now, said he. Pray come, you must come. I declare you shall come. You can't think how you will like them. Lucy is monstrous pretty, and so good-humored and agreeable. The children are all hanging about her already, as if she was an old acquaintance. And they both long to see you of all things, for they have heard at Exeter that you are the most beautiful creatures in the world, and I have told them it is all very true, and a great deal more. You will be delighted with them, I am sure. They have brought the whole coach full of playthings for the children. How can you be so cross as not to come? Why, they are your cousins, you know, after a fashion. You are my cousins, and they are my wives, so you must be related. But Sir John could not prevail. He could only obtain a promise of their calling at the park within a day or two, and then left them in amazement at their indifference, to walk home and boast anew of their attractions to the Miss Steeles, as he had been already boasting of the Miss Steeles to the Dashwoods. When their promised visit to the park and consequent introduction to these young ladies took place, they found in the appearance of the eldest, who was nearly 30, with a very plain and not a sensible face, nothing to admire. But in the other, who was not more than 2 or 3 and 20, they acknowledged considerable beauty. Her features were pretty, and she had a sharp, quick eye, and a smartness of air which, though it did not give actual elegance or grace, gave distinction to her person. Their manners were particularly civil, and Eleanor soon allowed them credit for some kind of sense. That's what Eleanor appreciates in someone else, sense. When she saw with what constant and judicious attentions they were making themselves agreeable to Lady Middleton. With her children, they were in continual raptures, extolling their beauty, courting their notice, and humoring all their whims, and such of their time as could be spared from the importunate demands which this politeness made on it. It was spent in admiration of whatever her ladyship was doing, if she happened to be doing anything, or in taking patterns of some elegant new dress, in which her appearance the day before had thrown them into unceasing delight. Fortunately for those who pay their court through such foibles, a fond mother, though in pursuit of praise for her children, the most rapacious of human beings, is likewise the most credulous, and the excessive affection and endurance of the Miss Steeles towards her offspring were viewed, therefore, by Lady Middleton without the smallest surprise or distrust. So the Miss Steeles are doing everything to get Lady Middleton's approbation, and they realize that in order to get to Lady Middleton, they should get to her kids. So they and Eleanor really appreciates what they're doing because she knows how hard it can be to be extra polite just for the sake of having someone's good graces. So she's admired. She admires by how the two girls um, act with the children. Look at that. Lady Middleton saw with maternal complacency all the impertinent encroachments and mischievous tricks to which her cousins submitted. She saw their sashes untied, their hair pulled about their ears, their work bags searched, and their knives and scissors stolen away, and felt no doubt of its being a reciprocal enjoyment. It suggested no other surprise than that Eleanor and Marianne should sit so composedly by without claiming a share in what was passing. John is in such spirits today, said she on his taking Miss Steele's pocket handkerchief and throwing it out of the window. He's full of monkey tricks. And soon afterwards, on the second boy's violently pinching one of the same lady's fingers, she fondly observed how playful William is. They're such terrible kids, and the Miss Stills are only pretending to like them because they want to stay in their house and be good guests. Um, but the mother does not see that, as the narrator puts it very wittingly. What is it? Fond mother is the most rapacious of human beings and likewise the most credulous. So she really believes her children are the best, but they're terrible kids. So one throws Miss Steele's pocket handkerchief out the window, the other one is pinching one of the lady's fingers, and the mother just says, "Oh, how playful they are." "And here's my sweet little Anna Maria," she added, tenderly caressing a little girl of 3 years old, who had not made a noise for the last 2 minutes. "And she's always so gentle and quiet. Never was there such a quiet little thing." But unfortunately, in bestowing these embraces, a pin in her ladyship's head dress, slightly scratching the child's neck, produced from this pattern of gentleness such violent screams as could hardly be outdone by any creature professedly noisy, let alone a one professedly quiet. The mother's consternation was excessive, but it could not surpass the alarm of the Miss Steeles, and everything was done by all three in so critical an emergency, which affection could suggest as likely to assuage the agonies of the little sufferer. She was seated in her mother's lap, covered with kisses, her wound bathed with lavender water by one of the Miss Steeles who was on her knees to attend her, and her mouth stuffed with sugar plums by the other. With such a reward for her tears, the child was too wise to cease crying. She still screamed and sobbed lustily, kicked her two brothers for offering to touch her, and all their united soothings were ineffectual, till Lady Middleton, luckily remembering that in a scene of similar distress last week, some apricot marmalade had been successfully applied for a bruised temple, the same remedy was eagerly proposed for this unfortunate scratch, and a slight intermission of screams in the young lady on hearing it gave them reason to hope that it would not be rejected. She was carried out of the room, therefore, in her mother's arms, in quest of this medicine, and as the two boys chose to follow, though earnestly entreated by their mother to stay behind, the four young ladies were left in a quietness which the room had not known for many hours. Such a sweet little angel, huh? This Anna Maria. Poor little creature, said Miss Steele as soon as they were gone. It might have been a very sad accident. Yet I hardly know how, cried Marianne, unless it had been under totally different circumstances. But this is the usual way of heightening alarm where there is nothing to be alarmed at in reality. What a sweet woman Lady Middleton is, said Lucy Steele. Marianne was silent. It was impossible for her to say what she did not feel, however trivial the occasion, and upon Eleanor, therefore, the whole task of telling lies when politeness required it always fell. She did her best when thus called on by speaking of Lady Middleton with more warmth than she felt, though with far less than Miss Lucy. And Sir John, too, cried the elder sister, what a charming man he is! Here, too, Miss Dashwood's commendation, being only simple and just, came in without any eclat. She merely observed that he was perfectly good humored and friendly. And what a charming little family they have! I never saw such fine children in my life. I declare I quite dote upon them already, and indeed I am always distractedly fond of children. I should guess so, said Eleanor with a smile, from what I have witnessed this morning. I have a notion, said Lucy. You think the little Middletons rather too much indulged. Perhaps they may be the outside of enough, but it is so natural in Lady Middleton, and for my part I love to see children full of life and spirits. I cannot bear them if they are tame and quiet. I confess, replied Eleanor, that while I am at Barton Park, I never think of tame and quiet children with any abhorrence. A short pause succeeded this speech, which was first broken by Miss Steele, who seemed very much disposed for a conversation, and who now said rather abruptly, "And how do you like Devonshire, Miss Dashwood? I suppose you were very sorry to leave Sussex." In some surprise at the familiarity of this question, or at least of the manner in which it was spoken, Eleanor replied that she was. "Norland is a prodigious beautiful place, is not it?" added Miss Steele. "We have heard Sir John admire it excessively," said Lucy, who seemed to think some apology necessary for the freedom of her sister. "I think everyone must admire it," replied Eleanor, "who ever saw the place, though it is not to be supposed that any one can estimate its beauties as we do." "And had you a great many smart beaux there? I suppose you have not so many in this part of the world. For my part, I think they are a vast addition always." And here the eldest Miss still uses the word beau, the French word for beautiful, Beau, acts as a plural to refer to beautiful young man. And that's all she cares about, the oldest Miss Steele. "But why should you think," said Lucy, looking ashamed of her sister, "that there are not as many genteel young men in Devonshire as Sussex?" "Nay, my dear, I'm sure I don't pretend to say that there ain't. I'm sure there is a vast many smart beaux in Exeter, but how could I tell what smart beau there might be about Norland? And I was only afraid the Miss Dashwoods might find it dull at Barton if they had not so many as they used to have. But perhaps you young ladies may not care about the beaux had as lief be without them as with them. For my part, I think they are vastly agreeable, provided they dress smart and behave civil. But I can't bear to see them dirty and nasty. Now there's Mr. Rose at Exeter, a prodigious smart young man, quite a beau, a clerk to Mr. Simpson, and yet if you do not but meet him of a morning, he's not fit to be seen. I suppose your brother was quite a beau, Miss Dashwood, before he married, as he was so rich?" "Upon my word," replied Eleanor, "I cannot tell you, for I do not perfectly comprehend the meaning of the word. But this I can say, that if he ever was a beau before he married, he is one still, for there is not the smallest alteration in him." "Oh dear, one never thinks of married men's being beaux. They have something else to do." "Lord, Anne," cried her sister, "you can talk of nothing but beaux. You will make Miss Dashwood believe you think of nothing else." And then, to turn the discourse, she began admiring the house and the furniture. This specimen of the Miss Steeles was enough. The vulgar freedom and folly of the eldest left her no recommendation, and as Eleanor was not blinded by the beauty or the shrewd look of the youngest, to her want of real elegance and artlessness, she left the house without any wish of knowing them better. Not so the Miss Steeles. They came from Exeter well provided with admiration for the use of Sir John Middleton, his family, and all his relations, and no niggardly proportion was now dealt out to his fair cousins, whom they declared to be the most beautiful, elegant, accomplished, and agreeable girls they had ever beheld, and with whom they were particularly anxious to be better acquainted. And to be better acquainted, therefore, Eleanor soon found was their inevitable lot. For as Sir John was entirely on the side of the Miss Steeles, this party would be too strong for opposition, and that kind of intimacy must be submitted to, which consists of sitting an hour or two together in the same room almost every day. Remember how I said that these young girls were forced to do things? So they didn't like the other girls, but they were forced to sit with them at least 1 or 2 hours in the same room every day. Sir John could do no more, but he did not know that any more was required. To be together was, in his opinion, to be intimate. And while his continued schemes for their meeting were effectual, he had not a doubt of their being established friends. To do him justice, he did everything in his power to promote their unreserve, by making the Miss Steeles acquainted with whatever he knew or supposed of his cousin's situations in the most delicate particulars. And Eleanor had not seen them more than twice before the eldest of them wished her joy on her sister's having been so lucky as to make a conquest of a very smart beau since she came to Barton. The gossip continues, spreads like wildfire, as George Eliot says in Middlemarch. It will be a fine thing to have her married so young, to be sure, said she. And I hear he's quite a beau and prodigious handsome. And I hope you may have as good luck yourself soon, but perhaps you may have a friend in the corner already. Eleanor could not suppose that Sir John would be more nice in proclaiming his suspicions of her regard for Edward than he had been with respect to Marianne. Indeed, it was rather his favorite joke of the two, as being somewhat newer and more conjectural. And since Edward's visit, they had never dined together without his drinking to her best affections, with so much significancy and so many nods and winks as to excite general attention. The letter F had been likewise invariably brought forward, and found productive of such countless jokes that its character as the wittiest letter in the alphabet had been long established with Eleanor. The Miss Steeles, as she expected, had now all the benefit of these jokes, and in the eldest of them they raised a curiosity to know the name of the gentleman alluded to, which, though often impertinently expressed, was perfectly of a piece with her general inquisitiveness into the concerns of their family. But Sir John did not sport long with the curiosity which he delighted to raise, for he had at least as much pleasure in telling the name as Miss Steele had in hearing it. His name is Ferrars, said he in a very audible whisper, but pray do not tell it, for it's a great secret. Ferrars, repeated Miss Steele. Mr. Ferrars is the happy man, is he? What, your sister-in-law's brother, Miss Dashwood? A very agreeable young man, to be sure. I know him very well. How can you say so, Anne? Cried Lucy, who generally made an amendment to all her sister's assertions. Though we have seen him once or twice at my uncle's, it is rather too much to pretend we know him very well. Eleanor heard all this with attention and surprise. And who was this uncle? Where did he live? How came they acquainted? She wished very much to have the subject continued, though she did not choose to join in it herself, but nothing more of it was said, and for the first time in her life she thought Mrs. Jennings deficient either in curiosity after petty information or in a disposition to communicate it. The manner in which Miss Steele had spoken of Edward increased her curiosity, for it struck her as being rather ill-natured, and suggested the suspicion of that lady's knowing, or fancying herself to know, something to his disadvantage. But her curiosity was unavailing, for no farther notice was taken of Mr. Ferrars's name by Miss Steele when alluded to, or even openly mentioned by Sir John. And this is the end of chapter 21, in which we saw the Palmers leaving and new people arriving, new characters, namely Anne and Lucy Steele, two very silly girls. They just want to please everyone. We don't know much about where they come from, but they are enjoying themselves at Barton Park, so they want to stay there. So they do everything they can to please the lady of the house. The eldest only talks about the beau, and Eleanor finds it so superfluous and irritating, but they are bound to be together because Sir John thinks they will be good friends, so they are forced to see each other for at least 1 or 2 hours every day. And in one of these conversations, Eleanor is surprised to know that the Miss Steeles know Edward Ferrars. And she wonders, how come? But no one seems curious enough to ask. And for the first time, she thinks, well, they could have used their gossip skills in this particular matter, but they don't. Well, so we reached the end of today's session. This was the longest so far, and I apologize, but there was a lot to discuss. These were longer chapters as well. We're reaching the end of volume 1. Next time, we're going to read chapter 22, which is the last chapter of volume 1. And we'll start with the first 3 chapters of volume 2. Or some editions, they start counting back to 1, and others continue counting the chapters. In any case, we're going to read chapters 1, 2, and 3 of volume 2 next time. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you are enjoying reading Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility and getting to know these characters better, how well she creates these characters as if they are real people, right? Megan says this last chapter's mood is definitely different from the others, especially in the chapter where John Middleton and even the Palmers are present. It feels cozy, where this just felt draining. Yes, you feel like Eleanor and Marian trying to get away from those silly girls, but they can't. And then Eleanor finds something very intriguing that she's curious about, and then the conversation is done. Megan says, but I absolutely love today's session. So glad I was able to make it. I'm so glad you made it as well. I'm so glad Michelle was also here live. Thank you for joining. And if you're watching the recording, thank you for watching the recording. Or if you're listening to it, thank you for listening. And we'll see each other next time for our session number 7 of the guided reading of Austen Sense and Sensibility. I'll see you then.